Welcome to the show. Today's guest has been at the forefront of some of the most important and difficult legislation Iowa has faced. From gender ideology to DEI, religious freedom, and private property rights, Representative Steve Holt has never wavered. This was one of the longest, most intense sessions in recent memory. Supposed to wrap up on May 2nd, but it just ended last week. Today, we're breaking it all down. Then we'll get into the questions from Patreon, Kairos Nexus, and our Facebook community. Representative Holt, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Oliver. It's great to be here.
It's always great having you on. You know, we did that legislative forum with you recently, with you, Representative Shipley and Representative Gelbach, and people were blown away at your clarity and at your constitutional conviction.
I had a great time at that forum. That was just fantastic. I'm so glad that you invited me. It was just great to see everybody there, and the questions were fantastic. And I was there, of course, with several other Patriot legislators, so that was just a fantastic time.
Yeah, it was. And you know, I think it's people don't really realize the work that you guys put in and what's really going on in the trenches. So when they get to hear it directly from you, I think it really lifts their spirits. And it gets them motivated to learn a little bit more about what's going on and how they can become involved.
Absolutely. Sometimes we're a victim of our own success in Iowa. I had somebody on my Facebook page a couple of days ago say, you know, something to the effect of, you guys haven't done anything. You don't deserve to be in the majority. And I'm like, what planet have you been on? I mean, we've done more in the state of Iowa when it comes to conservative policy and just fundamentally changing the direction of the state in a good way over the last decade as any other state in the country. So we've had a lot of success here.
No doubt. And honestly, it amazes me sometimes. People will ask questions about what's going on at the Capitol or about an issue they're having. And I'll say, Steve Holt's already working on that. You're usually right on top of it. And one of the biggest examples was the gender identity bill. And the last time you were on the show, we broke that down in detail, but I wanted to revisit it because that bill it wasn't just big, it was historic. And being at the Capitol that day was crazy. It was unlike anything I've ever seen in 5 years as being a citizen activist.
Yeah, it was. I mean, there was something between 2,500 and 3,000 protesters there that were shouting obscenities and all sorts of things. They certainly have a right to protest. That's our country. However, I think when you have family and you have children in the Capitol, while they may have the right to do it, it certainly wasn't very pleasant of them, or you know, they could have chosen different words, we'll put it that way, to how they protested, because there are families and children in there. But in any event, it had to be done. There was a lot of things said about that legislation that's just absolutely not true. Transgender individuals have the same rights as you and I do and every other American. It's just with the removal of gender identity as a protected class, their rights are not elevated above others, and therefore they're not going to be able to force themselves into women's sports and locker rooms and bathrooms in the state of Iowa. So it was something that had to be done, and we did it. We were the first state in the nation that, once gender identity or any protected class has been put into code, we're the first state that's ever removed it. It was put in when the Democrats had the trifecta. Some Republicans voted for it back in the day, a couple of decades ago, whether or not they realized what was coming, that the insanity that would ensue with men taking away women's trophies and women's opportunities, going into their sports, going into their changing facilities, going into their bathrooms, was just incredible, and it had to be done. It was restoring common sense and immutable truth based on biology to our code. So it had to be done.
You're absolutely right. And if anybody hasn't watched that episode, they really need to. I can put a link in the description because you really broke it down well. And you broke down the part, you really laid it out where what was being changed, what rights were being lost, which were really just the ability to infringe on women's rights in their private spaces.
Right.
And then the rights they weren't actually using. And, you know, when I watched that on the debate floor, I just don't know how you do it. But it seems like the Democrats, they create a narrative about the bill, and then they argue from that narrative as if the narrative's true. And then you have to go back and rebuttal and say, well, that's not what the legislation says. Here's what the legislation actually says. I just don't know how
It's
you deal with that. It's got to be
It is.
frustrating.
It is frustrating, especially sometimes, they'll literally say things that are just patently false that the legislation doesn't do at all. And you just have to set the record straight. And unfortunately, a lot of times the narrative that the media runs with is the narrative that the Democrats will, are putting out there on the floor, even if it's not true. And so that can be very, very frustrating. But as we pointed out, and as you just pointed out, the only rights, if you want to call them that the transgender community lost are rights they shouldn't have in the first place, such as the right of a biological male to go into female sports, or the right of a biological male to go into a female locker room or bathroom. It's ridiculous, but that's when they talk about loss of rights. That's what they're talking about. They didn't really lose any rights. They lost the ability to infringe upon the rights of others, but they have the same constitutional rights and protections as every other American, as every other Iowan.
Yeah, and I listened to that interview again the other day, and you had mentioned that because we've been putting these Band-Aids on the issues, we protected girls' sports, protected girls' locker rooms, showers, and bathrooms, changing facilities, protecting young women and children from mutilation and cross-sex hormones. And you said that because it was in the code, this gender identity vague cloud that really has no definition or medical diagnosis or anything, that there would be lawsuits. There's a contradiction there. And a week later, there was a lawsuit. Somebody sent me a copy of it, a PDF
Right.
of the filing, and there was a girl who wanted to use a boys' bathroom in a public school and cited that gender identity was in the Civil Rights Code. So that was their basis for the lawsuit.
Yeah, it was actually an adult female who identified as a male that wanted to go into the male restroom, if I recall correctly. So while we're warning that if we don't do this, if we don't strip gender identity, there's going to be lawsuits against all the bills. I ran the bill that prohibited gender reassignment procedures, mutilation surgeries on minors. I ran the bill that protected, that mandated that bathroom and changing facility use had to be based upon biology. Representative Skylar Wheeler ran the bill that protected sports. And sure enough, there was, as we're talking about this, a few days before we before we ran it on the floor, we find out that in fact there has been a lawsuit filed against the what's so-called bathroom bill, and so that just proved exactly what we were talking about. I think there'll be more lawsuits. This legislation takes effect July 1st, like all of our legislation does, unless it is put in there that it takes effect immediately. This takes effect July 1st, and so it would not surprise me if there are not lawsuits. We'll see. But in any event, we did the right thing, and nobody's rights have been taken away. Folks continue to say that. It's just not true. No one's rights were taken away. We protected the rights of women and males who don't want to be in with, females who've decided they're males across the board. We just restored common sense. It's that simple.
It was interesting to say the least. I mean, you mentioned 2,500 to 3,000 people there, and a lot of the license plates were from other states. They shipped people from all over the United States there, and they were loud, obnoxious, violent. I mean, I was harassed for testifying, and I can't imagine what you all went through as far as threats and things like that go.
It was interesting. There were death threats by email and that sort of thing, and you just forward those to Department of Public Safety and they look into them. That's just what we deal with in this day and time when you're doing anything. I think the things that really matter today when you do them, such as protecting women's sports or protecting their changing facilities, those sorts of things, or removing gender identity as protected class, you're going to have these sorts of folks come out of the woodwork. And we're in an interesting place in our society today where, violence and threats of violence are so commonplace. So we just moved through it. It didn't deter us at all. We did what we had to do and move on. So I think every Republican in the Senate voted for it, and there were a couple of Republicans in the House that didn't vote for it, but ultimately it passed with almost every Republican. It went to the governor. Of course, I think she signed it within a day or two. So it was
a little concerning there on Wednesday when that amendment dropped. But I think that was a testament to how important grassroots efforts are in getting the word out and getting everybody to shine the light on who was voting for what. I felt like it was a great victory. I mean, with everybody coming together in the state.
It absolutely was. And there were things done sort of at the last minute that one could argue that was an attempt to kill the bill. to kill the legislation at the last minute. Didn't work out. In fact, it backfired in spectacular fashion as the grassroots folks found out what was going on. And I think it ended up, as a result of that, getting more votes than it would have otherwise. And so the good Lord works in mysterious ways sometimes.
That he does. Now, we had a DEI bill that you ran through subcommittee. I testified at that one. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So obviously, the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at the region universities. A few years ago, I ran the bill to get rid of critical race theory. They've found different ways to call it different things and that sort of thing. Diversity, equity, inclusion, which is the opposite of, what it's doing is the opposite of what the name implies. It's horrible. It's teaching our young people to judge people by their skin color instead of their character. Exactly opposite of the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It's just, in one case we found at one of the universities that at some of the DEI stuff, it was saying that meritocracy is a part of white supremacy. I mean, anybody that, meritocracy is just getting promoted or, based upon your merit, based upon your work ethic and those sorts of things, and somehow that's part of white supremacy. So then what should be the standard for promotion? What should be the standard for being hired? Is it your color? Is it your sexual orientation? I mean, it's insane. So it had to be stripped out, and we've run several bills over the last several years to get rid of DEI, to begin to dismantle it, to defund it, and that work continued this year. The universities have at times been very resistant to it. At other times they've not, and they've complied and gone along. And so it had to be done. I ran that legislation. And I'm, to be honest with you, I'm not sure that passed in the Senate. I'm going to have to check and see if those were one of the ones.
It did pass in the Senate. The incredible thing was, and I know a lot about this one because you guys got it through subcommittee and committee pretty quickly. Right. And it went through the House floor pretty quickly as well. And then it went to the Senate.
Right. It did.
Yeah. And then it went to the Senate, and it sat in the desk drawer of the senator who was supposed to run the subcommittee.
Right.
I found out about it, and we met with Lynn Evans, the education chair, and we talked with him about it. And he and I and Amy Sinclair talked about it, and they decided to run it. They got it through subcommittee. They put an amendment on it that pulled out the private school portion of that when it came to the Iowa tuition grant. And then I think it was that Friday where they only ran one bill on the debate floor, and it passed. And we were under the impression that it would fly right through the House. But then Henry Stone, who put a lot of work into the bill, he's a champion, but he decided that he didn't like the amendment. And so there was a debate around that. They pulled it from the House, and I know you guys caucused on it. And I talked to Henry and a lot of legislators that day, and I know you guys decided to take the win.
We did, and that's why I was confused for a moment, because I think that we're talking two different bills. This was Henry Stone's bill. I also ran a bill that did some things related to DEI. I don't think that one advanced, but Representative, that's why I was. I don't think for some reason the Senate didn't advance the one that I ran that really went after DEI. But in any event, Representative Stone's bill was a big victory, and then the Representative Collins that ran a bill that created the School of Intellectual Freedom. Because there's just almost no conservatives on college campuses anymore. The vast majority of the administration, the vast majority of professors are of liberal persuasion, something like 95 to 99%. That's not intellectual diversity. The other side loves to talk about diversity all the time, but not when it comes to this. They don't want to have any diversity. And so in a university where young people are supposed to be exposed to a universe of ideas, they're only getting exposed to leftist ideas. And so the School of Intellectual Freedom is not going to favor conservatism at all. But the point of it is to try to get more, a diverse group of individuals with different political viewpoints in our regional universities. And so that's the point of that. And that passed through the House and the Senate, and it's going to be money was allocated for it. So that's going to be stood up. That's going to be fantastic for our young people, so they can be exposed to both political viewpoints. I think that's extremely important, not to favor one or the other. And so that's the point of the of this Center of Intellectual Freedom. So that's exciting as well. We've made a lot of progress on these issues.
Well, I can't wait to see that. I mean, we are way behind when it comes to the school systems and our universities.
Yeah, and we have a long way to go because a lot of the reason our young people in our public schools are being subjected to all of this gender ideology and all of these leftist ideas is that's originating and generating in these classes that our teachers are taking in their universities as they get ready to be teachers. We've got to change the culture, and so we're just getting started. There's a ton more to do to change the culture so that we're getting back to basics and actually teaching young people love of country, teaching young people, what they need to learn, reading, writing, arithmetic, all of these things that somehow have been replaced over the last few years by a lot of ideology that's being taught, leftist, unfortunately, ideology that's really destructive for our country and for our society. And so it's going to be a long, long road because so many of the folks in our education system are very, very liberal, and they're going to resist this every way they can. They're going to try to work around everything we do. So we just have to keep working at it and being vigilant to get it done.
Yes, we do. And, when we talk about DEI, we've gone so far that they're trying to teach kids that you're the oppressed and you're the oppressor, and that you have all these limitations put on you by how you were born and who you are, and that you should feel shame about who you are. It's gotten way out of hand. I talked to a young guy after he graduated from college. He went to work for a company where they were doing these DEI programs, and they were actually segregating people based on their race and color. I mean, it was like, holy cow, we've gotten incredibly far away from the vision that Martin Luther King Jr. had for this country.
When I was in junior high school in South Carolina, the school system was segregated. And I can remember vividly in my 7th and 8th grade year, that changed. And, black students went to the white schools and white students went to the black school. And I was in a junior high school that had always been white, and there were so many fights. It was unbelievable. The principal didn't have any control on it at all. The next year, I ended up being sent to the school that had been an all-black school, and the principal there, who was black, I just loved him to death. He just didn't take any garbage from anybody. He didn't care what color you were. These were the rules. If you didn't follow them, you got in serious trouble. And that was the most peaceful, wonderful education experience I've ever had. And to hear today, and President Trump's been going after these universities that are having graduations and they're segregating people based on race. I mean, for the love of heaven, we fought for years and years to desegregate and to come together so that, we were, trying to move toward a colorblind society. And here we are all of a sudden going backwards. And suddenly it's a great idea to segregate based on race. Suddenly they want to segregate college dorms based on race, and they want to have graduation ceremonies based on race. It's unbelievable. It's taking us in the opposite direction. And that's why our country is becoming more and more divided, because instead of trying to move toward being colorblind, now that's frowned upon by the left. You can't do that. That's terrible. And so it's just crazy, where we've gotten to in this country with all this stuff. The critical race theory bill that I ran a few years ago that outlawed, prohibited critical race theory. That's some of the stuff in DEI that you mentioned, teaching that if you're white, you're automatically an oppressor. If you're a minority, you're automatically oppressed. This stuff is this is why our country is becoming the way it is, and we have got to strip this stuff out. And I'm glad President Trump is working on the federal level as we've been working on it on the state level.
Yeah, we definitely had some big wins this session. What about the Conscientious Objection bill? That made it through the Senate, and I had talked to Representative Winchittle, and he had scheduled it to run on the House floor, and it was pulled last minute. What can you tell us about that? I think it was because of some language that they felt like needed cleaned up.
So I think you're referring to the bill about immunizations and all those sorts of things, correct?
SF 180,
Yeah.
which would make it so you could conscientiously object to an emergency use authorized product.
Yeah, you're right. I absolutely believe that legislation will pass early on in the next session. It's just, we were in the final days of sessions. We began to talk about it. There were some folks in the Health and Human Services Committee that weren't aware of the bill and hadn't seen the language. And then the Health and Human Services Director Garcia, there were just some concerns that we wanted to get answered. And we didn't have time to get them answered. There's a lot of support for that legislation. A lot of folks want to do it. So I believe it will. I believe it will go through within the first month or so of the 26th session.
We will do whatever we can to help. I mean, it definitely, that legislation would have solved a lot of problems that we had during COVID.
Yeah, and I had some conversations with Lindsay Mayer during that, and tried to explain to her what was going on. And we also ran a bill they were very concerned about. I think that's gone to the governor's desk, that says, the United Nations and the World Health Organization have no jurisdiction or authority in the state of Iowa. There's been a lot of concern during the Biden administration that more and more of our national sovereignty was being given away to those kind of organizations that I think have this globalist attitude and agenda. And so I think that was an important piece of legislation to run. I believe that's headed to the governor's desk. So we did have wins in that area. And I believe that this bill will also, that you're referring to, the Conscientious Objection bill, so to speak, to call it that, I think that legislation will pass early on in next session once we get those questions answered.
That's great. And that bill you just mentioned is incredibly important.
Absolutely.
It should be our elected officials making those decisions, not some foreign power or global organization.
Yeah, and just more and more you're seeing these organizations with this globalist attitude trying to, insert their authority throughout the world. And our country should not tolerate that. There's no way. We're too freedom-minded as Americans. We don't need the United Nations and the World Health Organization telling us what to do. And why in the world would we trust those organizations? They lied about COVID. They lied about the origins of COVID. Don't trust them as far as I can throw them. And so I thought that was a good piece of legislation that we passed.
Yeah, definitely. That was fantastic. And then we had SF6 pass, which mandated transparency about exemptions for schools, because they've been advertising no shots, no schools for so long, which simply isn't true.
Yeah, they were hiding. They weren't telling what the law really was. They were sort of misleading to some degree. You could say they were misleading parents. They weren't telling the full story. So we insisted they tell them the full story. That was another great piece of legislation.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of great legislation came through this session, and I was really pleasantly surprised. It seems like the caucus has changed enough that there are a lot of freedom-loving legislators at our Capitol right now, and really, they were just a pleasure to work with.
It's amazing the number of pieces of legislation that just a few years ago we would not have been able to do. The Conscientious Objection bill you were just talking about, we haven't gotten it across the finish line yet, but it would have not even gotten past subcommittee a few years ago. The World Health Organization and the UN bill we were just talking about, prohibiting their influence, that wouldn't have gone anywhere. Mandating to the schools that they have to tell the full story. All of these things a few years ago, we would have had a really hard time getting across the finish line. And that's how much our caucus has changed. That's how much the Senate caucus has changed as a result, I think, of the lessons we learned from COVID, but also as a result of the great work that Lindsay Mayer does in their organization, was Informed Choice Iowa, I believe, does tremendous work. And I think they've done a lot to educate legislators. A few years ago, they were kind of upset, and I don't blame them, over the bill we ran to, we were stopping COVID passports in the state of Iowa. We needed to go a lot further, but I couldn't get the votes at the time, and I had to take responsibility for what we did get passed. But that's just an example of how our caucus has changed drastically over the course of the last few years. And part of that is as the work that Lindsay and her group has done, and part of it is as we've become much more conservative through a couple of elections. So for sure.
And I believe people learned a lot from COVID as well. I mean, it was refreshing to hear senators and representatives on the subcommittee saying, Iowans were lied to over and over about COVID, about vaccines, about masks. And I think a lot of people have woke up from that. And you were supposed to end May 2nd, and the session just drug on, right? And part of it was because of the property rights issues, correct?
I'm trying to figure out a tactful way to say this. We've had a lot of trouble with the Senate. I think, frankly, the Senate was a little bit dysfunctional this session. We had a really hard time dealing with them, and we sent Part of it was a property rights issue. Absolutely. We were also, part of it was the eminent domain issue. We were also trying to get property rights, property tax reform across the finish line. We just couldn't get it done this session because the runs to check the data and confirm the numbers are taking sometimes 3 and 4 weeks to get back, and so we just couldn't get that done in a way where we were certain that what we were passing was going to get the job done and was going to be good for Iowa and good for property taxpayers. So that partly held us up, but mostly what held us up was the fact that over a period of 3 years, we sent the Senate 4 pieces of legislation to protect landowners from the use of eminent domain for the CO2 pipelines. They refused to take them up at all. And then this year, as I've said several times, the chickens came home to roost when 12 very brave senators, I think that they got nicknamed the Dauntless 12, said, we're not going to run any budget bills until you bring this bill to the floor for a vote. Maybe it's voted up, maybe it's voted down, but bring it to the floor for a vote so people can see. And there was a lot of resistance to that in Senate leadership. That spilled out onto the floor. It was most unfortunate. I have never seen in my time here, I've never seen a debate in which Republicans went after other Republicans, like they went after, for instance, Senator Kevin Alons, who is a man of great integrity, and they went after him on the floor to try to make him look bad. It was embarrassing for Republicans. I talked to a reporter that's covered State House for 40 years, and she said she'd never seen anything like it. So it's something that I hope I never see again. But in the end, the legislation passed. But that's a good one of the main reasons that we were here for longer than we should have been.
Yeah, it was definitely quite a deal. And you guys were there until 6:30 a.m. the other night. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think when I looked at the clock, I thought it was 6:31 a.m. when we finally adjourned for the year. So we went the entire night. It always seems to end up like that because in the final hours, there's a lot of horse trading being done between the two chambers. A piece of policy that we want really bad, a piece of policy the Senate wants really bad. And all of those things end up getting hung on the standings bill, what ends up being called the Christmas tree bill, where you put that final policy in. And most of that, all of that policy has already been through committees and passed one of the two chambers. So it's not like it has never been seen before or anything like that. But that's just sort of the horse trading that's done. I swear to goodness, I think we should be able to do it differently, but it happens that way every year. And so yes, this year was no exception. And whether it's Democrats in control or Republicans in control, it's the same way. It's just kind of how it ends up being. Maybe it doesn't need to be that way, but that's how it ends up. And now we're waiting on the governor to sign that important eminent domain legislation. And certainly hope and pray that she does.
Is there a reason to be concerned that she may not sign it?
Well, I think so. We don't know where she's at on it. The Senate worked very hard to try to paint it as a terrible bill, an awful bill. They said over and over again that it was written by environmental extremists, which is hilarious. It was written by Representative Charlie Thompson, who is a very conservative Republican in the Iowa House. It was not an environmental extremist bill. But to those senators and to anyone else who doesn't think it's a good bill, then my response to that is, where have you been for 4 years? If you think it's a bad bill, where's your bill? Don't give us that as an excuse not to vote for a bill when you have done nothing for 3 to 4 years to protect property owners. We sent you 4 pieces of legislation, so don't play the game that is terrible legislation. And the other thing is that Representative Thompson reached out to Senate members over the course of the week leading up to when the vote was taken, offering any assistance, offering to answer any questions. Certainly, we would have taken any kind of suggestions for amendments or anything that they might have wanted to do, as long as it didn't remove the protections for landowners that are currently fighting the eminent domain issue. None of that was forthcoming. So I think it's really, really interesting that they claim it's a terrible bill when they made no efforts whatsoever to change it or to tell us what they would like to see differently done in the bill. So I think that's just disingenuous. And so but it almost seemed like they were trying to lay the groundwork or lay out the reasons why the governor should veto the bill. And so there is concern. And that's why I said I'm hoping and praying that she's gonna sign the legislation.
For sure. And you put out a pretty powerful statement on your Facebook page from your Freedom Watch about that, and I know that people really appreciated you standing up for those senators.
I did, and I'm not going to stop doing that. I'm a Republican. I love my party. We have, as you've just enumerated, so many wonderful things we've done this session, and how many we've done in previous sessions, where we outlawed sanctuary cities, where we passed education savings accounts, where we've lowered taxes in a massive way. We've done a lot of incredible, incredible things. The Freedom Amendment into the Iowa Constitution, the right to keep and bear arms. I could go on and on and on because I've run most of those bills. But the truth of the matter is, in this particular case, I'm going to tell the truth. And in this case, the Senate is on the wrong side of history. It's just that simple. Republicans have always stood for property rights. We have always stood strong against eminent domain when it's not appropriate to be used. And now you are seeing Democrats positioning themselves as a result of what the Senate did. You are seeing Democrats positioning themselves as property rights champions. You're seeing Rob Sand do the same thing. It is an egregious mistake that I fear we're going to pay for in the next election. Let's hope not, because let's hope the legislation gets signed. But in any event, there's lots of folks, in my opinion, on the wrong side of history, and more importantly, on the wrong side of the Constitution of the United States, the Fifth Amendment, and the Constitution of the state of Iowa that say public use, not private economic development projects. So we'll see where it goes. There is a lot of concern, and we're not going to stop. We're going to keep working. We're going to do what we've got to do. There's also an effort by the Summit folks on the federal level to put eminent domain into federal law so they can just override the states and build a CO2 pipeline regardless of what the states do. I've been on the phone for days working on that issue, trying to get that taken care of. So there's sort of fronts in this battle everywhere, and it is nowhere near the end of the battle. This was a victory, but the battle continues.
Well, thank God that we've got an experienced Marine like you on the front lines of these important issues. You know, someone that's not a stranger to going into battle.
And it's not just me, Oliver. There's a lot of, Representative Charlie Thompson's incredible, Representative Helena Hayes, Representative Cindy Golding. They've been out front fighting this. And of course, you've got the Dauntless 12 or 11, I suppose it was. It ended up being in the Senate. But, Senator Kevin Alon, Senator Sandy Salmon, just a lot of folks that stood up over in the Senate as well. So we're continuing to work with landowners and do everything we can to ensure that their property rights are protected.
Well, that was a big win for them, too. And speaking of the Dauntless Dozen, wasn't Senator Lynn Evans part of that?
I believe that he was, yes.
I just saw that he announced he was going to run for Feenstra's seat for Congress. Right. And I saw an Iowa Standard poll that had you listed on as well. Do you have any desire to run for Congress or to do anything beyond what you're doing in the House of Representatives?
Well, let me be completely honest with you. That Iowa Standard poll, I did really well. I did really well in that poll. So I'll just be
you did. I think you slayed it.
I'll just be completely honest with you. I had 3 or 4 consulting firms who run campaigns contacted me, and they said, with the legislation you've run, the things that you've done, you're extremely well known. You're perfect for the district, and if you run, you're going to win. And I seriously considered it. I had a number of legislators whose names I will not mention contacted me and said, we're not going to run if you're going to run. And so I seriously considered it. And then a day or two ago, you must not have seen it on my Facebook post that I posted that I had made a decision not to run. And the reason for that, I'll be upfront with you. I feel like it's a demotion. After I talked to folks about what Congress is about, you make good pay, that's for sure, compared to Iowa, where we don't make good pay. But the fact of the matter is, I have the ability in Iowa to really make a difference. I have the ability in Iowa, and you can look at all the legislation. I've had the honor of running to uphold our founding values and to uphold the conservative values. It just isn't that way in Congress. It would be 6 to 8 years, I'm told, before I would even have any chance of having any influence at all. And then I'm told you have to be willing to vote for all sorts of bad bills in order to have anything that you want to go forward. You have to constantly fundraise, which is something I don't enjoy doing. I do it because we have to do it. But in the end, I'm like, why am I doing this? This is a demotion. I'm not going to be able to get anything done. I will get to walk around being called a congressman, but I'm not going to be able to do any of the things that I can do in Iowa. So in the end, it was like, no, there's just no way I'm going to do this. And so I was very seriously considering it at first. And then as I began to have these conversations with folks that had been there, with folks that had been congressmen, and then I talked to a gentleman who knew two legislators from Missouri. They were House members, and they ran and won and were in Congress. They liked it for about a month, and then they hated it because they can't get anything done. That's, it was a little bit, I'll be honest, it was a little bit disappointing to arrive at that conclusion, but it's just not for me. I want to stay exactly where I am and continue to actually be able to make a difference.
I don't think that I can say enough about how much I appreciate that. Somebody had asked me that question on Facebook, and I thought I would hate to lose him at the state capitol because you're making such a huge difference. People ask me about national issues, and they're often surprised that I don't pay as much attention as they do to national issues. And it's simply because I don't have control over that. I really focus on the circle of influence that I have, and that's really on the local issues that I can make a difference in. And I really appreciate that you're willing to stick to the place where you can make such a huge impact on the lives of Iowans.
Washington, D.C. is dysfunctional, and I have believed for quite a while that the fight to save the republic was going to be on the state level, and I continue to believe that. So there's about 24 to 36 hours that, hey, when you've got all these consulting companies calling you saying, if you run for Congress, you're going to win, you have to think about that a little bit. But in the end, as I began to talk to people, it just wasn't for me. So I'm happy where I'm at, and we'll move forward and continue to do our best to do the right thing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. What are your thoughts on the governor's race?
Well, it's too early to tell. I think I published a newsletter a few weeks back, and I said I hope that the citizens of Iowa will demand to know where every Republican candidate for governor stands on property rights as it pertains to CO2 pipelines and eminent domain. I think it's a vital question, and it can't be one of these vague answers, I'm for property rights, and then move on. Lots of people can say that garbage, and it doesn't mean anything. They need to get specific. What are you going to do to protect property owners that are in this fight with the CO2 pipeline companies? What are you going to do to protect their rights? Where do you stand? And as far as I'm concerned, anyone that doesn't give the right answer should be disqualified in the minds of voters, is what I'm saying. And so that's certainly what I'm going to be looking for. And not answering that question or answering it vaguely is unacceptable. And so anybody on the Republican side that's doing that, I hope that voters will just put a little X in the box and move on. That's what I'm going to do.
Thank you, Representative Holt, not just for being here today, but for standing courageously, session after session, for truth, for freedom, for the rights of Iowans. You are without a doubt an American hero and an Iowa hero. And we're grateful for your leadership.
Thank you.
And to those listening, this is where the public portion ends, but the conversation is far from over. In just a moment, we're diving into 20 minutes of exclusive content where Representative Holt answers direct questions from our Kairos members, our Iowans for Freedom members and supporters, and our Patreon community. If you're not already a member, you can join us right now at www.patreon.com/Oliver Bardwell, or just go to oliverbardwell.com and click Join the Fight. Your support gives you access to behind-the-scenes content, direct Q&A with legislators, and helps us continue bringing these unfiltered, impactful conversations. So stick around. This next part is just for you. And Representative Holt, thank you so much for joining us today. Your presence is always welcome. We love having you on the show. And God bless you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. God bless.